Let's speak now to Professor Everisto Benyera, who's an author, also an associate professor of African politics at Unisa. Prof, we've heard a lot of skepticism from some two previous analysts. We know that President Ramaphosa said the talks were impactful. There's a 10-point plan. It would be the first step in many that would be required to reach some sort of peace. Do you see it as a step in the right direction, or probably yet another failed peace mission?
Good evening, Sally, and good evening to the viewers. How do you measure impact and ascribe causation? Causation and causality are very important in politics, yet they are very problematic, not only to ascertain, but to measure. So what we do in political science is to try and disaggregate the issues of causality and causation and the resultant impact, which most people are very eager to know. What is the impact of the president's visit to Russia and Ukraine? We can do it in two parts. Firstly, based on outcomes, and secondly, based on processes. Some would love to do it based on both the processes and the outcomes, and that is very complex and very protracted. But we must also consider the environment within which the event whose impact is being measured occurred. The visit by the Africans to Eastern Europe, to me, heralded a very significant moment in Africa's history. For once, we are talking about African solution for global problems. For once, Africa is no longer a problem to be solved, but a global problem solver. Never mind the fact that we are going to succeed or to fail, but the fact that the African delegation managed to undertake that trip, albeit with many problems and booby traps that were placed in the road. They managed to speak with the two main belligerents, the two Vladimirs, Zelensky and Putin. And in my view, that on its own is a major success. Remember, Sally, the environment within which not only the war, but the talks also happened. There is a global thawing of relations. Look at Saudi Arabia and Iran. Look at the United States and China. Blinken was talking to President Xi Jinping today. So these thawing of global tensions can be traced to the pain that the globe, that we are all experiencing from the Russia-Ukraine war. So in my view, this is the beginning of a long journey towards negotiation and ending this war.
Yeah, you make such an excellent point, because polarizing and shutting people out is just going to create more and more of an environment to have two sides going to war against each other. And also, as you point out, so significant that Africa is acknowledged as a global player, that the African leaders were there to hopefully make a difference. Do you think that this 10-point plan is going to bear fruit? One of the issues on it was respecting the sovereignty of each country. Both countries are adamant that they're not going to cede any land to the other. So do you think it's a bit of a non-starter, or do you think that's something that might well be negotiated down the line?
The 10-point plan is a very good starting point, because the negotiations had to start somewhere anyway. And it now depends on the negotiators themselves. Which method, tactic, or skill are they using? Some negotiators prefer.
Prof, you've just broken up. You broke up very slightly on the line. You're saying that the 10-point plan is significant. You can just continue your thought, if you would, please.
So the 10-point plan is very significant. Others view it as a very radical approach. My view is that it depends on the method, on the strengths, and on the preferences of the negotiators. Some negotiators prefer to start with the areas of agreement where Russia and Ukraine agree. Then they move towards the areas of disagreement. Other negotiators prefer to start with the most contentious issues. Russian president being indicted by the International Criminal Court drop this. Then the Ukraine saying Russia must withdraw from all occupied territories. In most cases, this will end up with a form of a Korean solution, if I may put it that way. There's a demilitarized zone where Russia will push back to a certain point, Ukraine will push back to a certain point, and then the conflict is frozen, and then the negotiations will begin into the actual peace treaty. So in my view, let's give the negotiators the chance to negotiate. Eventually, it will come back to those that are sponsoring the war, those that are underwriting the war. What is the United States saying? What is the Chinese people saying? Because it is these two that have got the ability to back their actions in both Russia and Ukraine. Eventually, I think we will see the African mission going to the United States and also going to China to speak to these two, because in my view, Sally, the conflict is not yet ripe. If a conflict is not yet ripe, negotiation, mediation will be very difficult.
What do you mean by the conflict is not yet ripe? Are you suggesting there hasn't been enough conflict yet, that it's got to get to such a critical point that people are more desperate to negotiate?
You make a very good student of political science. A conflict is ripe. A conflict is ripe when the two belligerents are tired of fighting, when there is no clear winner, when none of the two is likely to win the war, when their backers are tired, when their backers are financially no longer capable of sustaining the war, when people have said, guys, let's come out of the trench, let's talk about a peaceful end to this war, because there is no likely winner. As of now, the Russian Federation thinks that it will win. Ukraine and its backers think that they are going to win. So this conflict is not yet ripe. And you cannot negotiate a conflict where both parties still believe that they have got a likely possibility of a military victory. The moment that a conflict is ripe, then negotiation and mediation will become very easy, and also they will tend not to be very protracted. However, having said that, it is important to begin the groundwork while the conflict is ripening.
Yeah, I suppose it's also about building up relationships, starting a relationship. The Ukrainian ambassador to South Africa said to me earlier, we hope this is just the first of many meetings. So it requires effort over time. Let's just talk finally about how Africa is being impacted by this conflict. We've seen the price of fertilizer skyrocket. We've seen shipments of grain being halted for a period, not getting to areas where they are desperately needed. And we know that there's conflict in the Horn of Africa. There are areas where there's going to be a great deal of humanitarian aid required. What is going to happen in Africa if this war continues for much longer?
One of the sad stories about this war is that everyone is a war victim. Whether you are in Somalia, whether you are in the DRC, whether you are in United Kingdom, and the price of gas has skyrocketed to a point where some poor families are almost freezing to death. The war in Ukraine produced global victims. If there is a lesson for politicians and statesmen and stateswomen to learn, is that the period where wars had a localized impact are over. A war in Eastern Europe, thousands and thousands of kilometers away, has got local implications here in Africa. Egypt relies on grain from both Ukraine and Russia. So the reason why Africa is so much interested in ending this conflict is that we cannot have a man-made disaster on top of other natural disasters, well, man-made as well, such as climate change and the internal conflicts that are going there. If the war in Ukraine ends, chances are that that will also de-escalate to the war in Sudan. Because if we had time, I was going to argue how the war in Sudan is linked to the war in Ukraine. that by putting out the bigger fire in Eastern Europe, these African leaders are actually also attending to the smaller fire that is happening in Sudan, because Sudan is almost now a proxy war of that war that is being fought by Russia in Ukraine. But most importantly, Sally, what this mission by African leaders demonstrated is that there is need for an increase on diplomatic pressure on the belligerents. Instead of supplying weapons, let's supply peace envoys. So there has been the Chinese, there has been the Indonesian, and then came the African Peace Initiative. Most importantly, an unprecedented number of countries are lining up to join BRICS. We are being told of numbers between 22 and 23. So this shows that the world is tired of being a unipolar place. Maybe after this BRICS conference in South Africa, if it is going to happen here, we will have a multipolar world, we will have a bipolar world. In my view, Africa and China are the greatest blocs that are not directly involved in this war. And if there is a very successful peace initiative coming from good office, it has to come from one of these two, and with the buy-in of the Americans.
Prof, absolutely fascinating, refreshing and inspiring views. And let's really hope that something starts to change, because we cannot afford to become a more and more polarized world. Thank you very much for chatting to us this evening. Professor Everisto Benyera, author and Associate Professor of African Politics at Unisa.